This is part of the ARINS initiative, which is a collaboration between the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, University of Notre Dame, and the Royal Irish Academy. This series has been going on now for some period of time, and there are major research outputs associated with ARINS. ARINS is analyzing and researching Ireland North and South. So the commitment of this particular activity is to try to understand the future constitutional arrangements in Ireland, but also the social, the cultural, the political relationships, and what form they might take. It's nonpartisan, but it's engaging in these fundamental questions. And one of the key series which is developed in this is Conversations on Britishness and Irishness. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers here today. This is also a collaboration with Queen's University Belfast, and we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, in a moment, and the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace. So without further ado, invite Richard English and Dame Louise Richardson to the floor.
Dan, thank you very much indeed, and it's excellent to be here for this latest conversation on Britishness and Irishness. As Dan said, this is a collaboration, this series, between the University of Notre Dame, the Royal Irish Academy, and the Mitchell Institute at Queen's, of which I'm the director. And it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished guest today, Dame Louise Richardson. Born in County Waterford, Louise Richardson studied history at Trinity College Dublin. She then studied at UCLA and at Harvard University, where she gained her PhD at Harvard, and then worked for 20 years on the faculty of the Department of Government, teaching courses on international security and foreign policy. After Harvard in 2009, Louise Richardson became the Principal and Vice Chancellor at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. In 2016, she became the Vice Chancellor at the University of Oxford. And in 2023, she became president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the philanthropic foundation founded in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie. At St Andrews, at Oxford, and at Carnegie, Louise Richardson was the first woman to hold those prestigious posts. In 2023, the Irish government asked Louise Richardson to serve as the independent chair of its consultative forum on international security policy. A prize-winning teacher at Harvard, Louise Richardson is a distinguished scholar. Her books include the classic 2006 study, What Terrorists Want, Understanding the Enemy, Containing the Threat. And among her many honors and distinctions, she has been elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Society, an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In 2022, Louise Richardson was appointed a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, DBE, in recognition of her services to higher education, especially her work to attract more students from disadvantaged backgrounds to be students at Oxford and students at St Andrews, and her decisive role in securing the partnership which made possible the production and distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, which was developed at Oxford. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dame Louise Richardson. The first part of today's conversation will involve me asking Louise some questions around our themes of Britishness and Irishness, and then there'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions, so please do prepare and think of the things you'd like to ask Dame Louise, and we'll look forward to getting through as many of those as we can. Louise, in your book, What Terrorists Want, you say that, I'm quoting, quote, "I grew up with a passionate hatred of England. And at school, you say, we learned Irish history as a long series of heroic efforts to throw off the evil yoke of the British." You also allude to some of the ways in which at Trinity your thinking began to evolve in different directions, perhaps. Could you say something about those early senses you had of Irishness, of Britishness, of Englishness, and about the influences upon you?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your days to be here. It's a pleasure to be back. Well, I expect my experience growing up may be similar to many people in the room. We, at school, gathered for assembly every morning beneath the crucifix and the Proclamation of Independence with the photographs of what we were considered the 7 martyrs who'd signed the Declaration of Independence. And so we grew up where the only version of Irish history we heard was one of Irish heroism and English perfidity, if you like. And so there was never any questioning of that. And it was easy to hate England and England as an abstraction because you never really encountered any English people. And then at one point, my parents, I grew up in Tramore, which is a seaside town, and lots of tourists in the summer. And some summers, my parents, to get more money, would take in visitors as B&B and turn the house into a B&B. And we'd all sleep in one bedroom and rent out the others. And then we had some English visitors, and this really threw me for a loop because these seemed perfectly reasonable people. And I then decided I hated the English government rather than English people. And I have to say, this didn't come from my parents at all, who were completely non-political. And in fact, I remember one of the teachers at school asking my mother, how was I such a rabid Republican? And my mother attributed to Keough-Naughton na Rinne, which may be the Ring Gaeltacht, where I spent every summer. But the more I read, the more I learned about broader perspectives, a different perspective on Irish history. Coming to study under T.W. Moody at history, I learned an entirely different version of Irish history, which when I would go back and explain at home, my mother would dismiss as Trinity talk. But I became fascinated by how two sets of people occupying the small island could have diametrically opposed interpretations of the same historical events. But I do think in terms of, and I may be jumping the gun here, being a citizen of a small, poor country that was colonized, if you like, versus being a citizen of growing up as a citizen of a more powerful country has an enormous influence on one's view of the world, and certainly had a great influence on mine. So I hasten to add that by the time I came to Trinity, and certainly by the time I finished at Trinity, I had a more nuanced perspective on Irish history and on Britain too.
And after Trinity, you moved to study in a much more powerful country, because you went to study at UCLA in Los Angeles on the West Coast, and then at Harvard and Boston on the East Coast, where you, as I say, worked for a long time at Harvard. Were there ways in which that period of living in the United States affected your sense of, altered your sense of Irishness?
Absolutely. Certainly going to California, where you realize that nobody appreciated these fine distinctions that were so important to us, and they didn't matter to them. I mean, people had no concept that Ireland, there was a Republic of Ireland that was independent of Britain, that was separate from Northern Ireland. People vaguely thought that Dublin and Belfast and London were all close together and occupied by similar nice people. So you suddenly realize that the things that were so important were in a broader scale much less important, and certainly not at all important to other countries. And yet there was this benign attitude towards Ireland, but a very vague, benign attitude. Couldn't understand why Catholics and Protestants were killing one another, but that was kind of perceived as part of the same mythology that Irish were drunks and fought brawls. You know, there was no sense that these, as I say, these political differences had any significance. Now, that was very different moving to Boston and Harvard. Harvard at the time was a very Anglophile institution, very, very few Irish students there, but in a very Hibernophile city, Boston. And I went to great pains, actually, in Boston to avoid the Irish-American community because I didn't want to be cast as an Irish-American, where I always felt the simplicity of interpretation increased with distance from the problem. So the kind of Irish community in Boston, I felt, had a view of Irish politics that was highly oversimplified and much more akin to the one I started out with than the one I held at the time. So it was very interesting in kind of navigating those two worlds, the very Anglophile Harvard in this very Boston city.
And thank you. And following up on that, you mentioned there the attitudes in Boston, which has some very strongly Irish identifying communities and attitudes, understandably. And the backdrop to some of that was the Troubles in the North. How much did that resonate with? How much was that a refraction of thinking about Ireland in the Boston that you encountered during the time that you lived and worked at Harvard?
Well, in the Boston of the time, we all knew which were the pubs that raised money and sent it back. There was, again, not a great deal of sophistication, but a great deal of sympathy. Not a great deal of sophistication of understanding, but a great deal of kind of reflexive sympathy for Irish republicanism in the city of Boston, and kind of we knew that, and local politicians played to it. There was a very powerful Irish democratic machine. Now, some people played an enormously influential role. People like Teddy Kennedy and Tip O'Neill, the Four Horsemen, played a very positive. I'm revealing my own prejudices here, but I would consider it a very positive role. And introducing John Hume and the kind of SDLP perspective as the kind of view of Ireland that people should rally around, and that was enormously influential in a city where those men were enormously influential. So the kind of support for republicanism was somewhat driven underground, and John Hume became, quite a hero. And this was helped, of course, by the fact that Seamus Heaney during this period also spent one semester a year at Harvard. And again, nobody had a more nuanced understanding of what was happening in Northern Ireland than he did. So, and he too was very careful to distance himself, I think, from the kind of unthinking republicanism that pervaded some parts of Boston.
Thank you. After Harvard, you then, as I said, moved to Scotland, where you were principal and vice-chancellor in a very successful period as vice-chancellor at the University of St Andrews. During that period, there was the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. Could you say something of looking close up in that period at Scottishness, Englishness, Britishness as they clashed, interwove, during a period when you were observing a febrile moment when it wasn't at all, I remember that period, it wasn't at all certain that the independence referendum was going to be lost. It looked quite close. Could you say something about your reflections on Scottishness, Britishness and Englishness as seen through the St Andrews lenses that you saw as principal?
Well, let me say that I was very saddened to learn of Alex Salmon's death this weekend. I knew him quite well. I served on his Council of Economic Advisors. And it was very interesting to see the Scottish view of the Irish, because Salmond absolutely assumed that I would support independence for Scotland as an Irish person. And part of the reason he cultivated me is not the right word, but he was a graduate of St Andrews, so there was a reason for us to be connected. But I think part of the reason he invited me to sit on the Council of Economic Advisors was not because of my economic skills, which are severely limited, but once he discovered that I spoke Irish, he was hugely impressed, and he once gave me a present of a book on Lower Moor, which is a book about Scottish, and was amazed that I could read it. So after that, he just assumed he had a partner, and always assumed I would be supportive of Scottish independence, and I wasn't, because I was looking out for the interests of the universities, and I felt universities would be damaged irreparably if they lost access to the bigger research councils that funded our research in St Andrews and other research universities. It was fascinating to observe the kind of very similar attitudes towards England. I mean, I was amazed to discover that Scottish people would I remember one of my colleagues saying, we used to go to holidays to this place every year, but now the English have been coming, so we're going someplace else. And this was an educated man. I was fairly stunned, but the English were separate, were different, and many Scots wanted to establish that independence and saw the Irish as partners in that, I think wrongly. And I don't think England at all understood where the Scottish were coming from. And not that the Scottish views were Scotland was very divided, and so many Scots had enormous success in British politics, whether it's Gordon Brown or Tony Blair or George Robinson, you name it, or indeed throughout history. And they all, by and large, wanted the Union, wanted to play on the bigger playing field, felt that Scotland's future was better as part of this broader universe, felt they could dominate in this broader universe because intrinsically felt at some level that they were at least as good. Most of them felt, I think, better than the average English politician, so on. So it was a completely fascinating time and was way too close for comfort. But you also saw, I think, part of the really small world that was Scottish nationalism. It was I felt, quite narrow and inward looking. And it was a very uncomfortable time for opponents of independence, because the government favoured independence and made it absolutely clear that they expected anybody dependent on the government, as universities were, to fall into line, and were fairly brutal when they didn't.
And after St Andrews, you then moved to be the Vice-Chancellor at Oxford, and during that period there was the Brexit referendum, another major referendum, which again involved complexities around Irishness and Britishness. Probably fair to say that the government in London didn't think through the implications for Ireland as much as would have been appropriate, but it affected particularly relations between Ireland and the UK over Northern Ireland. But also a lot of discussion around Brexit has focused on English national identity and how that relates to Britishness. Could you say something about what you experienced and saw and interpreted in terms of the Brexit phase around 2016?
Well, the biggest surprise to me in terms of Irishness and Britishness in assuming this role, which really was at the centre of the British establishment, if you like, is just how many people, particularly in conservative circles in Britain, had never really adapted to Irish independence. Never really felt that Ireland was a completely independent country. And I remember giving a talk at a club, and I can't remember what I said, but one of the people at lunch afterwards kind of said, well, but it's easy. You can just rejoin us. And I thought he was kidding, and then realised actually he wasn't. And the one particular story that had a big influence on me was at Davos. A member of the British cabinet was speaking Davos one winter, right in the middle of the whole Brexit debate. And I spoke to him afterwards, and I said, you've really got to think about what this means for Ireland. And he said, and he was a man I respected and admired, he said, Irish made such a terrible mistake. They should have just left when we did. He said, we'd be in a much better negotiating position if it was Dublin and London versus Brussels. And I said, but that's absolutely not on the cards. And he said, well, they're going to have to leave anyway, because it's going to ruin their economy when we leave. So they're going to have to leave. So it'd be much better. Terrible mistake on Ireland's part. And I said, that's just politically impossible. And he said, oh, but economics always trumps politics. And I said, well, gee, remind me when in the history of Anglo-Irish relations have economics trumped politics. But it was an attitude that even though I'd spent so many years in Britain, I was really surprised to encounter. My sense of the British government's attitude towards Ireland is and I think we in Ireland have often gotten this wrong. My view, it's not one of malevolence, as I had assumed as a child or had been taught as a child, but indifference. I think Britain simply didn't think about Northern Ireland. The kind of problem had been solved and become quiet after partition until the civil rights movement in '68. And then again, when it came to Brexit, they absolutely simply didn't think about the implications of this for Ireland, and particularly for Northern Ireland. And people who had worked hard to achieve peace in Northern Ireland, like Tony Blair or John Major, did try to raise this issue and never succeeded. It never succeeded in getting any traction at all. It was just... Actually, I do think the British government assumed that the EU would throw Ireland under a bus in the Brexit negotiations. they assumed right up to the end, and they proved wrong in that. And so I actually found it to be quite a difficult time to be Irish in Britain. You were watching this happen. You knew how, well, I felt it would be very damaging to Britain, but certainly felt it was going to be terribly damaging potentially to Northern Ireland and to Ireland, and you just couldn't get any traction making that point.
A number of those Conservative politicians are Oxford educated.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll move swiftly on. There has been regime change in London recently, owing significantly, I think, to Conservative unpopularity, and Keir Starmer's government seems to have established now more benign relations with Dublin, and the relationship has begun to emerge as a more positive one, perhaps. Is that your sense? And could you comment on your reflections viewing it from New York? Is the Dublin-London axis something which looks like it's a more benign and stable one at the moment under the new regime?
Yes, I think it really does. I would say I do think the Irish government, I felt very proud to be Irish listening to representatives of the Irish government on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4 in England throughout Brexit, being reason itself, arguing very reasonably throughout and in quite a compelling way. There's no doubt that the relations between Labour and Ireland this is a real opportunity to repair those relations which were damaged. I think Labour's attitude towards Ireland has long been much more pragmatic, much less of the historical overtones, much less of the view that I mentioned earlier, the sense that Ireland isn't actually independent. I think there's just much less of the historical overlay there. So what you actually had for the past several years, I found, where you had what I think will be the last of the Irish-American presidents in Washington. So you actually had the Irish government appealing to the Biden administration to put pressure on London. That's how the Irish government made progress with London. And they were lucky in having a very willing partner in Joe Biden, who was perceived as being quite, in Britain and by the Conservative Party, of being quite anti-British by virtue of being Irish, as it were. I do think into the future, irrespective of what happens next in the American election, whether it's Trump or Harris, neither one of them has a particular affinity for Ireland. For years, the British government have worried about a shift to the Pacific. They certainly worried about this most acutely with Obama, but ever since, that there would be less attention to Europe generally. And of course, Britain is less useful to the US outside of the EU than it was inside the EU, which is one of the reasons why historically, of course, the US encouraged Britain to join. So I do think we are entering a period of that will enhance relations between Britain and Ireland. Of course, there will be an election here before too long as well. So who knows how that would play out? But one might. I would be very hopeful that their progress could be made by just pragmatists, frankly, rather than ideologues on both sides.
You mentioned, Louise, the American presidency, and there's a major event next month with the election. None of us can predict with any certainty what's likely to happen, but you're based in New York now as president of the Carnegie Corporation. So a couple of questions from me on this. The first is about the election itself. I mean, were there to be a presidency with President Harris, or were there to be Trump too? Either way, that will have implications for Ireland. It'll have implications for the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland. Some reflections on that. I mean, some people are presenting this as a very, very pivotal election in American history, but also by implication for Western Europe in global history too.
Well, I feel I have to preface my response by saying I'm speaking personally here, so not at all on behalf of Carnegie, or not representing Carnegie. I think it is a really pivotal election, and I do think, like so many Americans, we're deeply worried about the future of American democracy when one of the candidates has not demonstrated a commitment to democratic principles. I think in either case, in the case of Harris, the person who, Philip Gordon, is her foreign policy advisor. He's somebody steeped in the transatlantic research scholarship. And so I think one could reasonably anticipate with the Harris presidency that one will have a kind of continuation of Biden policy towards something like, specifically towards Ukraine, although the Senate and the House are going to be very tightly fought as well. It certainly looks as though the Republicans will win the Senate, the Democrats should regain the House, but either way, they are not going to be able to get passage of any more $60 billion aid packages to Ukraine. So there will be a difference there. I do think, whether it's Trump or Harris, you're not going to get a president with a natural affinity for Ireland. That doesn't matter. Irish diplomats in the US are of the highest possible caliber, so there will be good relations there. But I think, like many people in America, I'm quite frightened about what might happen. What's interesting in the past just couple of weeks, as you know, once President Biden stepped down, there was a huge amount of enthusiasm and I think optimism amongst Democrats. That has faded. Things are now extremely tight, too close to call. I don't think anybody is prepared to call this election. What is appearing to happen, one of the things I've been fascinated in recent years is the educational divide and how education has become one of the strongest predictors as to how somebody would vote, degree of educational attainment. In this election, it looks like the biggest issue may be gender. Women overwhelmingly support Harris. Men overwhelmingly support Trump. And where this is particularly challenging to Harris is that historically, minority communities, especially Black and Latino communities, have supported the Democrats. Harris's support, especially among Black men and Latino men, is very significantly lower than it has been previously for Democrats. And that's in a race where the margins are extraordinarily tight. That could be all it takes. So I think it is a pivotal time, and not just for America. I used to say, gee, people all around the world should get a vote in American elections because they bear the consequences. To be honest, for Ireland, I don't think there are huge consequences, particularly for Ireland. We will lose having somebody who saw himself, Joe Biden, President Biden sees himself as a very, very close friend of Ireland. Whatever happens, we're not going to have that, but I'm much more worried about the fate of American democracy. I'm very worried about just the short term. If, as appears inevitable, this is a very tight election, what's likely to happen? I think we won't have a repeat of the attack on the Capitol because the Capitol will be well prepared, but where the battle will shift to is in the states. And one could certainly, there's a great deal of concern about political violence in many state capitals.
Thank you, Louise. We'll come to questions from the audience in a moment, so please do prepare those and we'll look forward to hearing those. One final question from me, which relates to the polarization in the United States and the violence, which you mentioned is one obvious potential symptom of that. I mean, in my visits to the US over the last few years, from the outside, it's looked more polarized than I've ever seen it before. Carnegie is committed to democracy, to education, and to peace. How big a role is there for the Carnegie Corporation in terms of the American future, in terms of democracy, in terms of education? Because it seems to me that this is arguably the most important, powerful country in the history of the planet in terms of its resources and its capacity, and the fraying of democracy and the division into fractions and factions is something dangerous in as well as beyond America, as you say. Can you say a bit about your vision for Carnegie in relation to that aspect of things?
Yes, well, actually, since assuming the presidency of Carnegie a year and a half or so ago, I have pivoted the corporation to addressing political polarization because I was stunned coming back to the US, having been outside the country for 14 years at the accelerated pace of polarization. And I think, we all witnessed real polarization in Scotland at the referendum, in Britain on the Brexit referendum. But post the pandemic, I think Britain was less polarized than it had been prior to the pandemic, whereas at the end of the pandemic, the scale of polarization in the US is truly off the charts. And it's not just people disagreeing with one another, but people actively disliking people with a different point of view. So we have initiated a raft of activities trying to address this in the short, medium, and long term. In the long term, we're asking all universities to nominate their academics who are working in this area, and we're funding research by about 30 academics a year, or each year for 2 years, who will help us understand and this problem. Secondly, at the kind of the medium term, we're supporting lots of initiatives which we think over time will help address it. So, for example, something that I expect to be very unpopular, and might be very unpopular in this country, but America is a country that has had the draft, and we think a national service, not necessarily military service, but community service would be a very good way to try and bring Americans together, to provide them with opportunities for interaction across race, class, region, and so on. So we're funding in a conservative state in Utah and a liberal state, Maryland, community service initiatives. So students at the end of high school, secondary school will go and work for a year in contributing to their community. This, we hope, will help bring people together. And then we're supporting a whole raft of kind of more immediate term initiatives. One I'm happy to mention because it's led by an Irishman, Colin McCann, called Narrative 4. And I think he has introduced it in a number of secondary schools in Ireland too. And it's about bringing kids from very different backgrounds together and having them learn each other's stories and relate their stories to one another. So in the US, you'll have kids from the Bronx and kids from Tennessee learning about each other's life story and then conveying the world as they see it. Anyway, these are, this is just one foundation. This is what we're doing. We're working with lots of other foundations. Another thing a whole bunch of us have gotten together to do is fund local news media because local news has simply collapsed in the US. The media is totally polarized, so, a conservative and a liberal just hear completely different news every night when they turn on the news. So trying to foster local media, because it actually happens that at the local level, American government works. The smaller the community, the better it works. So we are doing everything we possibly can to try to mitigate this polarization, which really has the potential to completely undermine American democracy, not to be too hysterical about it.
Thank you very much. It sounds like incredibly important range of work. And thank you, Louise, for those answers. We've covered a lot of material there listening to Louise Richardson. There's now the opportunity for there to be questions from the audience. Is there a microphone which can go round to the questioners so that they can be heard? There's a question here on the left. Thank you very much. Yes? Thanks very much indeed.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Cassidy. I'm a lecturer at Oxford on diplomacy, AI and technology, and actually did history at Trinity myself. And first of all, I just want to thank you. I've been in Oxford for 12 years, but for your tenure at the university, it was absolutely wonderful to have you there. And specifically, and you've mentioned it here already, but specifically at the university with your focus on the admissions process, really with a real keen spotlight on equality and accessibility for students. I really want to thank you for that. This is not a political, or well, it is, everything's political, as they Foucault, I won't go into that, but really looking at the devastating effects that Brexit has had on UK universities. And just I'd like your personal opinion on what do you see as the really key problems and areas that we in the universities in the UK now need to focus on, and any policy recommendations that you can see regarding how we can overcome this. I know that's probably a PhD question, but if just briefly, if that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your comments. Well, at Oxford, the number of EU students dropped in half. And immediately after Brexit. So 8% of our students came from the undergraduate students, and it dropped to 4%, which is deeply damaging to cultural cultural life of the university. We don't want to become just an English university. Because the financing of graduate education is different, it's been had less of an impact at the postgraduate level. Any parent in the room will know one of the wonderful aspects from the education point of view of membership of the EU is the Erasmus program, and English students are now excluded from that. There have been efforts to produce, this is, for those of you unfamiliar with it, it's whereby students can travel and study in any other countries in the EU with ease and able to transfer credits back. So it's a real way of fostering cultural understanding, broadening people's perspectives by finding out, by living and working and studying in another country. So one policy recommendation would be to figure out a way to get back into Erasmus. I think it's generally accepted that Brexit has not been a success for Britain, for any part of Britain really. There's no noises from the new government that they're planning to do anything radical at this stage. I do think over time they probably will try to. I think their effort at the moment, which is probably the best thing one can do, is to just try and figure out every way they possibly can, short of reopening negotiations, to make ties closer with Europe. And I think we at universities should be at the forefront of that. And as far as possible at universities, I think we should be fundraising to try and provide scholarships for the EU students we're losing, because now the only EU students who can come to a place like Oxford are those who can afford to pay foreign fees. So we're losing these extraordinarily smart kids that we used to get from Eastern Europe or from families that didn't have lots of money, and that's a huge loss to us. But I think just keeping a focus on it.
Thank you, Louise. Next question was at the back there, and then there's a couple of questions here at the front after that, but lots of questions. Rory first.
Yeah, thank you. Rory Montgomery, former Irish diplomat, a member of the Academy. I'm very much involved with ARINS and also a Trinity history graduate. I'm sure there will be a non-Trinity history graduate asking a question soon. Two questions. First of all, your academic speciality was terrorism. And to what extent do you think that the sort of Irish-British history of terrorism and counter-terrorism has had an enduring effect in the relationship, or has it largely passed, leaving Northern Ireland to one side? Second question, I mean, we're used to seeing Irish people in prominent positions in British life now, 2 Lord Mayors of London, for example. Were you ever aware of any overt or covert sort of grumbling about the fact that an Irish person, and in particular an Irish woman from a Catholic background, was serving in this extraordinarily prestigious position?
Thank you, Rory.
Thanks, Rory. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like to take a couple?
No, I think if you take this one, then we'll maybe take a group after that, Louise. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Well, on the last question first, well, I just decided early on not to be sidetracked by grumblers, and I never knew whether the main objection was my gender, my nationality, my religion, whatever. So I just chose not to worry about any of it. And I do think, going back to a point I made early on, to a degree that surprised me, amongst the deepest centres of the establishment, was perfectly natural for an Irish person to be in this role, because they never really perceived Ireland as different, and that was the big surprise to me. I don't want to put myself in the same category as Oscar Wilde, Irish people who Britain, if you like, have claimed, and culturally in many ways have been, or for many years were claimed by Britain and perhaps neglected by Ireland. So I think there was that tendency, that this historical sense that, the Irish are really, some Irish are really us anyway. Your first question on, yes, of course, the whole terrorism issue, well, that frayed relations throughout Northern Ireland, the very different perspective in Dublin and in London on what was happening in Northern Ireland, even though it came to a period and ultimately peace was restored only through close collaboration between the two countries, or the two capitals. But the perspective undoubtedly was very different throughout. And that, I think that exacerbated the difference, or exacerbated difference between the two for a very long period. You know, something like Bloody Sunday or the Widgery Tribunal, which were, you know, seminal events in my childhood. You know, the perspective on them was so different in Britain versus Ireland. I think that really did colour the relationship for years to come.
Thank you, Louise. If it's okay, Louise, I'll take a few questions at a time. So the next three I had, there was a lady there with a question, then one at the front, then one on the front left, then we'll take another round of questions after that. So thank you.
Hello. Natasha Weir-Brown, born in Dublin but educated entirely in England. I was, as a former literature student, I was very interested in your saying that the Carnegie is now investigating the way stories and the exchange of stories can be used. Now, of course, I'm totally pleased to hear that. But one thing that worries me is the concept of ethos. I mean, we heard about it only last week with Dundalk Grammar School saying they're going to stop Gaelic games in their school because of their ethos. There's the ethos of the Orange Order. I've always asked myself in sport, how come the rugby ethos managed to keep an All-Ireland team going and the football ethos, the soccer, not Gaelic football, soccer ethos, couldn't? And I just wonder if I could have a few of your thoughts on ethos and how we can affect that. Can stories help older people as well as younger people to break down the barriers between us? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question just in front of you, a couple of rows in front. Thank you very much. Andy?
Former director of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in Armagh. As a Northern Ireland Protestant brought up largely in England and now living over 50 years in the Republic, I see a contradiction in public opinion here in the Republic vis-à-vis Northern Ireland and movement towards a united Ireland here in the Republic. As you said, people here in the Republic are instinctively anti-British, whereas Northern Protestants are unionists, and unionists who they want to attract into united Ireland are instinctively and passionately pro-British. I wondered if you had any reflections on that.
Thank you, Andy. And then the third question in this cycle from a gentleman on the left here. Thank you. There's a microphone for you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I think it was J.J. Lee who said that during the Second War, the guarantor of Irish independence was the next door island. And recently there's been quite a lot of sensible discussion about the Irish neutrality. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Thanks very much. So three questions there, Louise, and then we'll take another round after that. Thank you.
The first question was on stories and ethos. I think sports are enormously important. I think music in particular is enormously important. I should have said right at the beginning, I think I learned much of my then republicanism from listening to the Waltons programme on Irish radio. My sister, one of my sisters was in hospital in Dublin for a couple of years, and we used to all pile into the car and drive up. And sorry, this seems like a tangent, but it isn't really. But the Waltons, I don't know if you remember the Waltons, the strapline is, if you feel like singing, do sing an Irish song. And they were all the rebel songs, because I learned them every Saturday, I knew all of them. And again, these songs tell a very unnuanced version of Irish history, and they are a way of conveying an emotive, oversimplified interpretation, and I do think they had that impact on me. By contrast, sports, as you say, rugby, to see both sides playing for Ireland is I would hope, the way of the future. I know the number of athletes, the Northern Irish medal winners in the Olympics, I think split 50-50 between Britain and the Republic of Ireland. So I think it would behoove all of us, rather than banning Gaelic games, I would hope we could expand Gaelic games and draw others into teaching, to engaging with them, because the GAA is a powerful community builder, and I think what we need are more diverse communities, and with the immigration in this country, we have an opportunity to integrate people from different backgrounds into these traditional sports, and the sports will benefit from them. But it's, I agree with you, storytelling and inclusivity is the way of the future. Quite how to do it, I'm less clear, but I do know that education, especially in the early years, is really critical to changing the culture. On the question of contradictions, I think Ireland's attitude toward Northern Ireland is full of contradictions. I think some of the work that's being done by ARINS is demonstrating that while people in the Republic will say they would like to have a united Ireland, they haven't really thought through what price they would be prepared to pay. And just to link these two questions, for example, if Ireland were to be united, one part of the country is currently a member of NATO, one is not, would the Republic of Ireland be willing to sacrifice its neutral position? So I think Ireland, because the South hasn't been confronted by the reality of Northern Ireland, they haven't had to engage seriously with these questions. I have noticed, and I've really appreciated, that one hears less about a united Ireland and more about a new Ireland, which is a much more inclusive concept to me, but one that's not going to come about until we think through all the implications for everybody on this island of what it would mean. So because it hasn't been a realistic proposition, I don't think people have had to make difficult trade-offs.
Neutrality.
And then on neutrality. Well, this is an issue on which it's undeniable that Irish independence during the Second World War was defended by Britain, although it's also the case that both Britain and Germany, so both sides in the Second World War, had drawn up plans to invade Ireland for very different reasons. And I think it's very healthy that the government here has started to have a discussion about Irish neutrality and what it means, because the neutrality we enjoy doesn't really fit with any accepted interpretation of neutrality, because we're not a member of any military alliance, but our political sympathies are unambiguous, and we do participate actively in EU defence, collective defence, and indeed even with NATO and the Partnership for Peace. So again, and the world is changing, because historically our geography was enough to ensure broadly our independence, but now with the fiber optic cables going across our coast, with Russian submarines circulating the coast, with, as we've seen with the cyber attacks, our vulnerability to cyber attack, we do have to revisit what we mean by neutrality. And I do think, unlike every other country in Europe which is neutral, they all are in a position to defend their neutrality. Ireland is not. Again, it's been a case of not having had to confront it. So if anybody were to challenge our neutrality, we couldn't defend it because of the size of our armed forces. Unlike countries like Finland and Sweden, who have conscription, Switzerland the same, Austria the same. So we're in a very Irish situation where we have our cake and we're eating it too.
Take another round of questions. There's a gentleman there about halfway back, and then there was a lady about a few rows from the front after that. Thank you.
Thank you for your lovely talk. I was just curious, do you think there's a sort of a wave of British-Irish engagement that goes into slumps? If you imagine the Anglo-Normans came in 1169 and it took pockets, and then you have to get to the Statutes of Kilkenny or something where they felt the place was becoming too Irish again, and then it would go on for another while, and then Henry VIII would do something, and then it would slump back into kind of ignoring the place, and then we'll go up to Grattan's Parliament, and there's a kind of another phase of there's quite a good economic status for Ireland at that time, and then Britain kind of did the Act of Union. So there's kind of phases of interest and disinterest. Is there some kind of fairly impressive current phase of English interest in Ireland and regaining the place even? The United Ireland might ultimately be a united Great Britain and Ireland.
Thank you. And then there's a question here, the lady there. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you very much again for the lovely talk. There are a couple of words that keep repeating in your discourse: perspective, historical overlay, and I'm very conscious of the fact that you yourself are a historian, and there are many historians here. I was reminded in this context of E.H. Carr's famous adage, you know, there's no such thing as history, there are only historians. And so in that context, it seems to me that Ireland has been trying to look at itself more than it had previously. That's undoubtedly the case. I think that's less the case in England. I was shocked to be seated by a middle-aged man, a lawyer from London, sometime last year at a dinner, and we got discussing Ireland, England, and he and the relations. And I asked him about the education that he had received as a school child, and he said nothing at all about Ireland. And then I asked him, well, what did you learn at school about your empire and how extensive it is and the extraordinary reach that it had? He said nothing. So I think there's a huge amount of ignorance on the English side. I'm a bit confused about Britain and Englishness, because it seems to me the Scots have their own identity and characteristics, the Welsh too, but it's the English, I think, who stand out in this regard. They have a complete lack of understanding and knowledge because they have no knowledge. So I just wonder if you discuss that a little bit.
Thank you. And then we'll take a third question from Mary Daly and then ask Louise to answer those three, if we may. Mary.
I really want to follow up on that, Louise, because I was struck when I was looking at the programme, Britishness and Irishness. The average Irish person refers to England. I mean, it's 800 years of English misrule. And I really do think teasing out, I mean, as you said, there was this debate about English nationalism that reared its head in the post-Brexit era, and there were attempts by some people to look at that. Could you just disentangle that a little bit more? And then before I sit down, just one comment. The comment that resonated with me most in what you said was the understanding that in Oxford, a lot of people did not recognise the legitimacy of an independent Ireland. I was a student there in the early 70s. Fairly rough times, Bloody Sunday, Widgery et al., and I got into a long argument one night with a fellow student, also historian, well informed about 19th century Ireland, and we went on for about 30, 40 minutes, the two of us. Everybody else had gone off from the common room, and he ended up by putting the rug from under me, having agreed with everything, said Britain made one mistake in Ireland, we shouldn't have left in the 1920s. I ran out the door and nearly knocked the warden flat. And he called my husband a couple of days later to see was there anything wrong between us, because I was in floods of tears. But it was a very instructive lesson for me as a historian of 20th century Ireland. It actually did change a lot of the way I assessed many historical issues. You went to the States, I went there, and it was very significant for me, and it really informed so much of my teaching. I'm a bit shocked to hear that things were not that much better when you were there many years later.
Three more sets of questions there, Louise.
Thank you, Mary. I do think things are better, to be fair, and I think the views that we both experience are confined to a smaller group than would have been true when you were a student there, and I certainly hope that's the case. On the question of Englishness versus, we haven't mentioned the Welsh at all. They're always the forgotten ones. Yes, we're mainly talking about England when we refer to Britain, and this is a real point of contention amongst Scots. Part of the problem is the discrepancy in size between England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. If you look at the American states and their federal system, yes, you have, there's a whole diversity of sizes, but you don't have any one state that is much bigger than the others. And that, I think, drives a lot, much bigger, much richer, much more powerful, and holds the capital city where most of the wealth resides. So that's why I think it's the English, the culture that has dominated. Although, you know, Irish and Scots have done, and indeed Welsh, have done extremely well in, you know, the expansion of the British Empire and in British cultural and political life. Ultimately, Brexit was emphatically an English phenomenon. It wasn't the Scots, it wasn't the Irish, north or south, who thought this was a good idea. It was very much an English nationalist phenomenon. And it's hard to see how that can change, just given the discrepancy of wealth and size and influence of the different component parts or the different nations of the UK. Now, it doesn't follow that smaller, weaker ones should hive off. I think one of the great benefits to the world that the EU has brought, I've always felt, is to downplay the importance of borders. That's why I opposed Scottish independence. I felt it was a step backwards, that we should make the borders less important. That's what the Good Friday Agreement sought to do here too. But it does require a greater wisdom amongst those in the seat of power in England, in Westminster, if you like, a greater sensitivity to the interests and the perspectives of the smaller nations than they've often demonstrated. And I'm afraid I forget the first question. Oh, right. History, and I couldn't agree with you more on the importance of history. And you know, I don't think it's fair to say that the English are ignorant. I think I don't think enough history is taught in any schools anywhere. And while I learned a great deal of Irish history at school here, I'm not sure that I learned much of anything about British history, or certainly not until I went to university did I learn European or American history. So if I had influence on the school curriculum, I would significantly increase the history taught. And I do think it matters in terms of developing a sense of national identity, certainly. And we're seeing this in the US at the moment, where kids by and large don't know US history, and indeed what should and should not be taught at school is now becoming a much fought over issue. And then there was the very initial question about the slumps, if you like, in Anglo-Irish relations. Slumps was your word. As Richard and I were talking before we came in, Richard said something with which I agree entirely, which is that, which is another way of categorizing what you said, which is that Anglo-Irish relations tends to go from crisis to crisis. So there will be a crisis and Britain will pay attention. And then the crisis is resolved, and then Britain, England, moves on and doesn't pay attention again until the next crisis emerges, and partly due to neglect. I don't honestly think Britain has designs on Ireland. I think there are certain members of the establishment, I have learned to my surprise, who think we should never have left and should rejoin Britain. I do think that's a relatively small number. People tended to laugh when you said, "What about we rejoin?" But actually, I think that's been on the cards. The notion of, well, would Ireland would a new Ireland rejoin the Commonwealth, for example, as a price for making a new Ireland more attractive to unionists in Northern Ireland? That's not an inconceivable proposition, it seems to me. I'm not a betting person, but if I were, I wouldn't bet it would pass in a referendum today, but one could imagine a situation in which it would. And indeed, De Valera considered something like this during the Second World War as a trade-off in return for getting Northern Ireland. I think Garret Fitzgerald considered it at one point as well. So it's not as outrageous as it sounds, but I don't think Britain is clamouring to regain Ireland. Yeah.
We've got time for one more cycle of questions. There was a question, two questions on the left. There's a gentleman with his hand up, and then the three people in front. There's one there as well. And then there's a question from Dan at the end. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for your very illuminating reflections. My name's Stefan Rimner. I'm an assistant professor at University College Dublin and earlier did my PhD at Harvard. I was wondering, since there were so many questions already about what role historians can play, whether in the history of using education for the purposes of depolarization, there are specific examples, perhaps in international history, that you think we should draw on, particularly because there's so much talk these days about higher education in crisis, and I think much of the diagnoses are realistic, but are there any reasons for optimism when we go back in time and look for successful cases where the instrument of higher education was in fact effective in enacting depolarization? Thank you.
Very much. And then there's a question about 3 rows in front. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Frances Ruan. I've worked with on the Council of Economic Advisors with you many years ago in Scotland. And maybe just to start with that very briefly, because I'm struck by your comment, because what you really said was, as head of a university, I didn't think it was in Scotland's interest to go separate. And I was just wondering if you'd been head of a university in 1922, where you would have stood on the issue of Irish independence, which I suppose points to the notion that where you stand depends on where you sit. But I really want to go back to your starting point of the school history piece. And I think it seems to me that your learning from that is influencing your view with Carnegie and the objectives they have. And I really think it's hugely important. And I think the earlier speaker relating television to education is actually a hugely important thing, because I remember after Brexit, Will Self, who's a British journalist who was over in Dublin, and I asked him maybe about a year and a half later, I said, well, what did you think really caused Brexit? And he said, just looked at me straight in the face and said, have you ever read an English school history book? And I said, well, actually, no. And he said, well, you would discover that single-handedly we won the First World War and the Second World War. And he gave a whole rake of other things, which did not include the empire as part of where we were. So I think that issue of linking the history piece, and we have to say we can't, you know, in the States it's a real issue. You couldn't get history books into the schools at this stage, which is a real problem. But I mean, we can't just abandon things until everybody's gone through an education system. But I do think that that's really important. Final point I'd just like to make to you, again, you used the word perspective and somebody else picked up on that. And I think it is always fascinating when you've been in different places, the different things that you see. But I was struck when you talked about the EU and closer relations, and you talked about Erasmus sending European students to the UK. But I think what really matters actually is sending English students to the continent, because I think that's the two-way flow that's really important in order to get the relationships back on an even keel. And I think one-way flows or unidirectional doesn't actually help. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was Dan at the front, and then I'll give Louise a chance to respond to those 3 questions, and that'll be the last cycle. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan Carey. I really enjoyed this very much. I wanted to come back to the question of national service that you discussed. Speaking as an American, I think there was a huge missed opportunity after 9/11. I think that was the moment in which the country could have chosen a different path and to say, look, we're taking this country for granted. We're taking all that it provides us with for granted. We need to do something to give back. It wasn't, in other words, in a moment of polarization as such, but I really think the strategy that you're proposing is very welcome, and those experiments that you've mentioned were really worth thinking about. There are obviously things to consider in an Irish context as well. There's different experience in Europe, but maybe there's a larger lesson about the tendency for complacency and to take for granted things that we have.
Thank you.
On that last point first, yes, this was, I couldn't agree more. And we're seeing, especially in the polls in the US, young people have a losing interest and faith in democracy, and increasingly isolated from their community. So the idea being, if they were to have the experience of giving more to their community, they might appreciate it more. The problem in the US is the federal level, just nothing is happening. So our goal there is to first these 2 states, but we're in negotiation with 4 others, and we hope that if a number of states launch successful programs, that this will eventually cover all the states. But yes, I agree, the ideal time to do it might have been after 9/11, although there you'd have had large numbers rushing to join the military, which would be fine, whereas we're interpreting national service much more broadly than military service. Frances, lovely to see you again. On teaching history, we recently funded a study which I found very interesting and consistent with other studies of parents in America, conservative and democratic parents, or Democrats and Republicans, on what should and should not be taught in school. And what we discovered was that about 7% on each side, if you like the extremes, conservatives felt slavery should not be taught, kind of thing. Only 7%, and similarly, similar set on the Democratic side. But there was actually an enormous convergence on what ought to be taught. But there was gross misunderstanding of what the other side thought should be taught. So Republicans felt that Democrats didn't want to teach anything about, one side thought, trans rights were being shoved down their children's schools. The other thought the iniquities of slavery was being shoved down their children's throats, when in fact most parents actually agreed on what ought to be taught in schools, but thought the other side didn't. And that's consistent with studies of kind of politicians versus the public at large. Our leaders tend to be more polarized than the population at large. And this is accentuated in the US case by the nature of the political system, where you have a two-party system, and you have primaries where to win a primary you have to play to the extreme and so on. Whereas I think the Irish political structure of democracy in Ireland really mitigates against a similar kind of polarization, which is a really positive thing. But we're absolutely agreed on more history all the time. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the first question. Oh, yes, of course. Sorry, you were asking, I beg your pardon. Yes, a historical example, I beg your pardon. Well, I spend my life in universities, and so I'm a perennial optimist, because universities are the last bastion of the optimist. And I generally think education is the solution to every problem. But I'm having a hard time coming up with actual examples of cases where higher education has actually solved a problem. It was completely appalling in Weimar, Germany, for example, how many academics actually sided with the Nazis, which is not what one would expect or what I would have hoped would happen. And I think we should all accept that our universities have accommodated a degree of ideological conformity which is quite unhealthy, and that we have been resistant to as much ideological diversity as in our universities as I think would be healthy, and as I hope we've learned from this experience we'll be much more open and solicitous of diversity in all its perspectives, in all its meanings. But actually pointed to an historical example. Can you help me out? Can you think of one, Richard?
Well,
Re-educating.
I think there's also, close to home for us at the Mitchell Institute in Queen's, in Northern Ireland, it's still the case that for many Northern Irish kids going to university, the first time they're formally educated with someone from the other community is at the university. And while I wouldn't want to exaggerate the benefits of that, it does seem to me that there's of necessity some kind of accommodation and comity, if not amity, which has some footnotes to it. So while I don't think it's been utterly transformative in producing peace, I think the effect of a genuinely shared space of education in a divided society as we move out of conflict into something more benign has been a non-trivial development. So I think that would align with the sorts of things you were arguing.
Mm-hmm. Sorry? Yes, yeah, okay. We are seeing today, sorry,
carry on.
American universities today are or everyone I know, setting up programs to teach students how to disagree responsibly and so on. Now, in a sense, this should have been done long ago. We shouldn't have to teach this, but we clearly do have to teach it. And I think a lot of universities now are working very hard to try to help students disagree in a constructive way and engage with conversations they don't like and perceive part of their education as being to listen to the other side. I would say when I was at Oxford, I did every single student who matriculated as the price of getting admitted to Oxford had to listen to a lecture from me. And every one of them got the same lecture. And it said to them, look, you're going to hear views you don't like. You have no right not to hear them. Your responsibility is to engage with them and be open to, endeavor through reason to change their mind, but above all, be open to having your own mind changed. And my mantra was the Augustinian one, audi alteram partem, listen to the other side. And I think students have got to get that message from the minute they walk into school, and they shouldn't have to get it when they come to the university, but if they need it, they should absolutely get it there.
It's a very appropriate note on which to finish, Louise, because one of the things when the Royal Irish Academy and Notre Dame and Queen's set up this series of In Conversation discussions was the idea of people having different perspectives put publicly in ways that could be respectful, that could be dialogic, that could be mutually informative. We've covered an enormous amount of ground today in a very vibrant conversation. Thanks very much to colleagues from the Royal Irish Academy and Notre Dame for hosting this. Thanks to the audience for your participation and for the wide range of questions. You're all very warmly welcome to join us now here in the Academy for some lunch if you have time to carry on the conversation informally. But for a wide-ranging set of rich insights based on incredible experience and wisdom, please join me in thanking our guest, Dame Louise Richardson.